Your son believes you abandoned him. Then why has he been searching for me?
Sir, don't leave. You're the only person who can save him.
For 6 years, a rich man made my son believe I had abandoned him. Then his family begged me to donate the marrow that could save the boy they stole. I was ready to walk away until a nurse opened my file and whispered, "Sir, don't leave. Your son has been searching for you." Hello, my name is Daniel Mercer, and 6 years ago, my father-in-law used his money, his lawyers, and one carefully planned lie to erase me from my son's life. He almost succeeded. If you had met me back then, you would not have seen a dangerous man or a careless father. You would have seen a 32-year-old mechanic with oil under his fingernails, a small rented house in Ohio, and a 5-year-old boy named Ethan who believed I could fix anything: broken bicycles, toy cars, monsters under the bed. I believed it too. My wife, Claire, had grown up in a different world. Her father, Richard Vale, owned apartment buildings, warehouses, and half the commercial property in our county. He wore suits that cost more than my truck. He never raised his voice, because he had learned that powerful men did not need to shout. From the day Claire introduced us, Richard treated me like a temporary mistake. At our wedding, he shook my hand and said, "Love is exciting when you are young. Eventually, reality sends the bill." I smiled because Claire was watching. But I understood the warning. For the next 7 years, Richard tried to control our marriage with money. He offered us a house, but only if the deeds stayed in his company's name. He offered me a management job, but only if I stopped working at the garage I had built with my best friend. Every gift had a string, and every string led back to his hand. Claire hated fighting with him. She often said, "Just let him feel useful." So I swallowed my pride more times than I can count. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday in October. Claire had been driving home from her mother's birthday dinner. A truck crossed the center line. She died before the ambulance reached the hospital. One moment, I had a wife, a son, and a future. The next, I was sitting beneath white hospital lights while Richard stared at me, as if I had caused the storm. At the funeral, Ethan held my hand so tightly that his little nails cut my skin. Richard knelt in front of him and promised, "Grandpa will make sure you never lose anything again." I thought he meant love. He meant control. 2 weeks later, Richard asked me to bring Ethan to his lake house for the weekend. He said the boy needed family and fresh air. I agreed because I was exhausted, grieving, and trying to keep my repair shop alive. On Sunday afternoon, I drove to the lake house to pick him up. The gate was locked. Richard called me from inside. "Ethan is staying with us for now," he said. I laughed because the sentence made no sense. "Open the gate, Richard. You are unstable, Daniel. You are drowning in debt. You have been missing work, and yesterday you threatened me." "I never threatened you." "That is not what the witnesses heard." Then, the line went dead. The police arrived 20 minutes later. I showed them Ethan's birth certificate. I showed them family photographs. I told them my son was behind that gate. One officer looked embarrassed as he handed me a temporary emergency custody order. It claimed I had become violent after Claire's death. It claimed I drank heavily. It claimed Ethan was afraid of me. All of it was false. But the document was real. The first hearing happened 4 days later. Richard arrived with 3 attorneys. I arrived with a lawyer I could barely afford. Richard's housekeeper testified that she had heard me threaten to take Ethan and disappear. A former employee from my garage claimed I drank during work. Bank records showed late payments and growing debt after Claire's funeral. Then Richard's attorney played an audio recording. My voice said, "If you try to take my son, I swear you will regret it." I had said those words at the locked gate. They removed everything before and after them. The judge ordered supervised visitation while the court investigated. I thought the truth would save me. Instead, money buried it. During my first supervised visit, Ethan ran into my arms. He asked why I'd left him at Grandpa's house. I told him I had never left. Before I could explain more, the supervisor stopped me and wrote something in her notes. "Do not discuss the case with the child," she warned. At the second visit, Ethan was quiet. At the third, he asked whether I was sick. At the fourth, he asked if I was going to jail. Someone was feeding him fear one small spoonful at a time. Then came the accusation that destroyed what remained of my life. Police found prescription pills in the glove compartment of my truck. They were not mine. The bottle had no label. An anonymous caller had reported that I was selling medication from my garage. The charges were eventually dropped, but Richard did not need a conviction. He only needed suspicion. My visits were suspended. My customers disappeared. My partner bought my share of the garage because legal bills had emptied my account. I sold my truck, then Claire's jewelry, then almost everything else I owned. At the final custody hearing, Richard's attorneys presented me as a grieving, angry, financially ruined man under criminal investigation. The court granted permanent guardianship to Richard and his wife, Margaret. I was allowed to send letters and request future review after completing counseling and financial rehabilitation. So I did everything they asked. I attended counseling. I took drug test jobs. I rented a clean apartment with a bedroom for Ethan. Every month, I mailed him a letter. Happy birthday, buddy. I still remember the blue bicycle you wanted. I saw a red-tailed hawk today. You used to call them Sky Kings. I love you. I did not leave you. I will never stop trying. Every letter came back marked Right you are to send R. Richard changed Ethan's school, his doctors, and eventually his last name. When I filed for review, I learned that Richard had moved the family to Virginia. The case transferred. Hearings were delayed. Documents vanished between offices. My new attorney discovered that notices had been mailed to an address where I had never lived. One night, a private investigator I had hired called me. Daniel, he said, someone is watching you. They know every job you apply for and every petition you file. You are not fighting a custody case anymore. You are fighting a system someone is paying to keep closed. That was the moment I understood. Richard did not simply want custody. He wanted me to become tired enough to disappear. For Ethan's sake, I stopped charging at the wall, but I did not surrender. I moved to Pennsylvania and started over under the quietest version of my own life. I repaired industrial equipment at night and studied accounting online during the day. I kept copies of every court paper, returned letter, drug test, and receipt in a steel cabinet. I also registered as a bone marrow donor. Claire's younger brother had once survived leukemia because of a stranger's donation. After Claire died, donating felt like keeping one piece of her kindness alive. 6 years passed. Ethan turned 11 somewhere without me. Then, on a cold Monday morning, I received a call from a transplant coordinator named Nurse Alina Ruiz. She said I might be a rare genetic match for a child with an aggressive blood disorder. She could not tell me the child's identity. She asked whether I would come in for further testing. I agreed immediately. 3 days later, I was sitting in a hospital consultation room when the door opened and Margaret Vale walked in. She looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen her. Her expensive coat hung loosely from her shoulders. Behind her came Richard leaning on a silver cane. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Then Margaret whispered. My body went cold. She explained that Ethan had severe aplastic anemia. Medication had failed. No one in their family was a full match. The donor registry had identified a potential match, and when the hospital confirmed my name, the family requested a private meeting. Richard did not apologize. He sat across from me and placed a folder on the table. You will be compensated, he said. Medical costs, travel, missed work, and an additional $200,000 after the procedure. 6 years vanished, and suddenly I was back at that locked gate. You stole my son, I said. Margaret began crying. Richard's jaw tightened. This is not the time to reopen old disputes, he replied. You told him I abandoned him. What gave him stability? You gave him a lie. Richard pushed the folder closer. Whatever you believe happened, a child's life is now at risk. His words were cruel because they were true. Ethan's life mattered more than my anger. Richard knew it. He was using my love again, just as he had used my grief. I asked one question. Does Ethan know I am the donor? Margaret looked at Richard. That glance told me everything. He believes his biological father refused contact years ago, Richard said. We do not want to upset him before treatment. I stood up. Then find another donor. Margaret grabbed my sleeve. Daniel, please. I pulled free and walked into the hallway. I was not truly planning to let Ethan die. I only needed air. I needed one moment in which Richard did not control the room. I had almost reached the elevator when Nurse Ruiz hurried after me, holding a tablet and my donor file. "Mr. Mercer, don't leave," she whispered. "Someone has been searching for you." She led me into an empty office and closed the door. 6 months earlier, Ethan had asked a hospital social worker for help finding his biological father. He had found an old photograph hidden inside one of Claire's books. On the back, in Claire's handwriting, were the words "Daniel and Ethan, my two favorite troublemakers." Ethan began asking questions. Richard told him the photograph meant nothing, so Ethan searched in secret using library computers and a borrowed tablet. He found an old newspaper article about my garage. He found my name in a charity race result, and he wrote a letter to the hospital's social worker. Nurse Ruiz showed me a scanned copy. "My name is Ethan Vale, but I think I used to be Ethan Mercer. I have been told my father left because he did not want me. I don't know if that is true. If you find him, please ask one question. Did he ever get my letters?" I could barely breathe. "What letters?" I asked. Nurse Ruiz opened another document. Ethan had written to me for years. Birthday cards, questions, drawings, even apologies for being angry. He gave them to Margaret, believing she mailed them. I had never received one. The mystery was no longer whether Richard had lied. The mystery was how many people had helped him. I told Nurse Ruiz I would complete the donation. But I had two conditions. Ethan had to be told who I was before the procedure, and all communication about the transplant had to go through the hospital, not Richard. The hospital's ethics team agreed. Richard threatened legal action. This time, I nobody Ethan the next afternoon. He looked small beneath the hospital blankets, but his eyes were Claire's, gray, alert, and impossible to fool. I stopped at the doorway because I did not know whether to hug him, shake his hand, or apologize for 6 stolen years. Ethan made the choice for me. "Did you get my letters?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I wrote to you every month." I placed copies of my returned letters on his bedside table. His hands shook as he opened the first envelope. He read 3 lines, then looked up at Margaret, who stood near the window. "You said he never wrote." Margaret covered her mouth. "Your grandfather thought." I asked what you said. She broke down and admitted that Richard had ordered every letter intercepted. She said he believed any contact with me would confuse Ethan and weaken their custody case. Ethan turned toward me. "Did you stop trying?" "I stopped letting him see me try," I answered. "That is not the same thing." Then my son held out his hand. I crossed the room and took it. The transplant preparation took several weeks. During that time, Ethan and I rebuilt our relationship in tiny pieces. We talked about school, baseball, Claire, and the blue bicycle he barely remembered. I never asked him to choose between me and his grandparents. I did not have to. The truth was making its own choices. Meanwhile, I began my investigation. The hospital social worker connected me with a family rights attorney named Maya Chen. She reviewed my steel cabinet of records and immediately noticed something my earlier lawyers had missed. The witness who accused me of drinking at work had received a job from one of Richard's companies 2 weeks after testifying. The housekeeper who claimed I threatened Richard had received a paid-off mortgage, and the anonymous drug report had been called in from a prepaid phone purchased by Richard's security chief. Then Margaret brought us the final piece. She gave Maya a flash drive containing emails between Richard and his attorneys. One message discussed creating enough documented instability to make Mercer's removal permanent. Another instructed an employee to redirect my letters. A third mentioned paying a court clerk to send notices to the wrong address. "Why are you giving me this now?" I asked her. Margaret looked through the glass at Ethan sleeping. "Because I told myself we were protecting him," she said. But when he asked whether his father loved him, I watched Richard lie without blinking. I finally understood that we were protecting Richard's pride. The donation procedure was not dramatic. There was no grand speech, no sudden miracle. There were needles, fatigue, long hours, and frightened waiting. But 3 weeks later, Ethan's blood counts began to rise. The doctors called it an excellent early response. That same morning, investigators served warrants at Richard's home and corporate office. The emails led to charges involving bribery, evidence tampering, obstruction, and conspiracy. The former employee and security chief accepted deals and testified. The court clerk admitted changing my address in exchange for payments. Richard's money had once made every door open for him. Now every open door revealed another crime. At the emergency custody hearing, Richard arrived in a wheelchair. His attorney argued that removing Ethan during recovery would be harmful. Maya calmly explained that I was not asking to drag a sick child anywhere. I was asking for my legal rights to be restored and for Ethan to decide where he felt safe while recovering. The judge spoke directly to Ethan by video from the hospital. "Where would you like to live when your doctors release you?" she asked. Ethan looked at me, then at Margaret. "With my dad," he said, "but I want Grandma to visit if she tells the truth from now on." The judge restored my custody and issued a protective order preventing Richard from contacting Ethan without supervision. Richard later pleaded guilty to reduced charges to avoid a public trial. He lost control of his company, paid substantial restitution, and served time in federal prison. His attorneys insisted age and illness had weakened him. I felt no joy hearing that. Revenge is not always a celebration. Sometimes it is simply watching a powerful man face the same thing he forced on everyone else, consequences he cannot purchase away. Ethan came home with me 5 months after the transplant. The apartment bedroom I had kept ready for years was too childish for him, so we repainted it dark blue. We built shelves together. On the top shelf, he placed every returned letter I had written. Beside them, he placed copies of the letters he had tried to send me. 2 stacks, 2 lives reaching for each other through a wall built by one man's pride. Recovery was not perfect. Ethan had nightmares. He became angry without warning. Sometimes he asked why I had not fought harder, and I answered honestly, I had fought until fighting the wrong way risked destroying me. Then I learned to wait, document, and survive. Adults often believe love makes them innocent. It does not. I loved my son every day, but he still lived 6 years believing I had left him. His pain deserved more than my explanation. Margaret kept her promise. She visited, attended counseling, and answered Ethan's questions without excuses. Forgiveness did not come quickly, but truth gave it somewhere to begin. 1 year after the transplant, Ethan and I returned to Ohio. We drove past the old lake house, now sold to pay Richard's legal debts. The iron gate was open because a real estate agent was showing the property. Ethan asked me to stop. We stood at the entrance where I had once begged to see him. For years, I had dreamed of returning as a victorious man and watching Richard suffer. But standing there with my son beside me, I understood that Richard's punishment was not prison, lost money, or public shame. His real punishment was that he had spent 6 years teaching Ethan to fear the truth. And the moment Ethan learned it, Richard lost him forever. Ethan slipped his hand into mine. "Ready to go home, Dad?" he asked. I looked once at the empty house beyond the gate. Then I turned my back on it. "Yes," I said, "we already are." And that is the lesson Richard never understood. Money can hire witnesses, hide letters, but it cannot erase a father who refuses to stop loving his son. In the end, the truth did not just open the gate. It brought my boy home.